Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that, plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. Today, I think mainly we're going to talk about the Abrego Garcia case, which you know about. This is the one with the uh, man, immigrant from El Salvador who was under one of these TPS programs, where it's this kind of funny status where you sort of don't have official status, but you're protected from being deported. It's what the government often does with countries where there's a finding that it's too dangerous to go back. Under the Biden administration, you had that with Haiti, you had it with Venezuela. You've seen all the different parts of this case. We're going to get into all of them, and then we're also going to talk, I think, about this Supreme Court election down in North Carolina, which is still being, held in suspense. What are we, 6 months later now? Upwards of that. I also want to remind you, we have this live in-person version of the podcast that we are doing in Chicago on May 14th. We've actually sold out tickets for it. So fantastic. Thank you so much for your support. We're looking forward to seeing you in Chicago. We do have a waiting list. So if you're still interested, you can put your name on the waiting list. And again, thank you for the support of everybody who already purchased tickets. So let me just turn it over to Kate to start with, because I believe just as we were getting ready to start the podcast today. And as usual, just to remind you, we are recording this just after noon on Wednesday, April 16th. There was just some new court activity. Kate, why don't you kind of walk us through what the new stuff is?
Yeah, so this is tangential to the Abrego Garcia case, but it before that one started really moving, it was kind of like the main disappearing of the Venezuelan case in the federal courts, and where that one has been, it's been up to the Supreme Court, it's come back down. Now the district court judge is basically trying to detangle whether or not the administration should be held in contempt of court for ignoring his orders to, turn planes around if there were detainees on them, or to bring people back into US custody, if they'd already landed in El Salvador. And there's been some back and forth there for a long time. The DOJ has been really not forthcoming, just kind of repeating the same things over and over, not really putting forth any relevant information. And right before we started recording, the judge handed down an order saying, there's probable cause for contempt of court. So, kind of shuffling along there in the direction of charging the administration, which you would then think they'll appeal, will get back up to the Supreme Court again. So, that one is kind of percolating in the background, while the specific Abrego Garcia case moves forward, which the last we heard from the Supreme Court there was the unanimous 9-0 ruling, that the administration had to, quote unquote, facilitate his getting out of the El Salvadorian jail. And that has kind of dominated the headlines because of this just gruesome Oval Office meeting earlier this week that was Trump and Bukele, the El Salvadorian president, where they did this just grotesque little like two-man show where Trump was like, "Well, I don't have the power to get him back. He's in El Salvador." And Bukele was like, "What, you want me to smuggle a terrorist into the United States? That's what you're asking?" And it feels mean to be hard on the White House press corps at a time that they're kind of, under this like indirect attack from the administration as well. But Caitlin Collins is the only one who kind of asked a question about this, and then they deflected with that little two-man dance, and then the next reporter just moved on to something else. And you had Stephen Miller chiming in saying, the court ruled 9-0 in our favor, that the courts can't interfere in foreign policy decisions. It is so beyond me why not one reporter knew enough about this case to say, "No, that's not what it said." And why are you
Like
saying
exactly the
that?
opposite of what happened.
Right.
Yeah. Let me ask you on the what we on the um case that we started with you updating us on. There was the issue where the what started as his case they took out of Boasberg's hands. Now is the contempt part of that still in his hands? Can you
That's
walk
right.
us through that? Okay, so he's still holding on to that, but
Mhm.
the broader question was moved to what, the Southern District of Texas?
For them to file the habeas petitions, right.
Right, right, right. Okay, okay. And tell us, okay, so I just want to kind of get this all the different legal pieces out there. Tell us about who is the judge and where is the jurisdiction where the Abrego case part of this is being done. What's going on there?
So, yeah, that's in the District Court of Maryland under Judge Zinnes, which has kind of become the tip of the spear for these cases because now that, you have to do the individual habeas petitions for these other guys, it's just you got to start over again, right? So that
Yep.
kind of slowed it down. And this one, for all the attendant reasons, most specifically that the administration admitted under oath that this was an accident, has kind of, become the tip of the spear, even though they're trying to walk that back now as well. The newest on that is Stephen Miller is saying that the person who said it was an accident was this, Democrat mole who has since been fired, a reference to the DOJ lawyer, telling the judge that it was an accident. But then you're met with the fact that, the Solicitor General, a different DOJ lawyer, the ICE, agent in charge of this case have all said, under oath that it was an accidental deportation.
Yeah, well that gets into something that is, it shows that some things are still in place, and one of those things is that you can lie constantly in a press conference, in the daily White House briefing, in what Steve Miller says, in what Donald Trump says. I mean, not only can you, that's de rigueur. I mean, that's what they do. You can't lie in court. You can't lie to a judge, and that can't still mostly holds up, right? I mean, I guess this was that Arez lawyer. I'm saying the first name because I don't remember his name, but those are the ones we're talking about. Those two career lawyers who were put on leave, and I assume they're being fired, even though they're one is like a decade career and the other's like a 30-year career lawyer. But as you say, it's not just them. They said it, but it was based on testimony of various people in the ICE sort of framework. Now, do we, just to kind of get everything out there, do we know, from my understanding is there's that case that I believe is housed out in California with the gay makeup artist, that one they're also trying to do. And it's one of the perverse things about this, that I think everybody is, he's being labeled, and I'm sure by his own attorneys for understandable reasons, the gay makeup artist, because I think everybody assumes, well, obviously he's not a gang member. He's this gay guy. He's a makeup artist. Come on. And look, more power to them, because they want to get their guy out of the gulag. But it does sort of the reason that the Abrego case has become, as you say, the tip of the spear is that the the administration conceded the point. It was an error. It was our mistake, and that is so golden from a legal standpoint, that you have the contrary party basically, uh, representing the central issue.
Which they're also trying to muddy the waters there by saying, "Oh, no, he's actually an MS-13 member," which the quote unquote "proof" there is almost, kind of comically compromised. It was this former cop who lost his job because he was found to have be like a serial liar and to have given private information to like a sex worker in exchange for her work. And he said that Abrego Garcia was known to be part of the MS-13 cell in, I believe, Western New York, a place that he had never been. So that's what they're kind of resting on now. And it is, it's such a combination of the different kind of fundamental tenets of the Trump administration, which is, the inability to apologize or ever admit a mistake. Like that is a cardinal sin that if you commit, you don't get to be in that world anymore. And then there's also the kind of ghoulishness, this idea that, well, he kind of deserves it anyway just for like being a brown guy. That was so encapsulated in the White House or in the Oval Office meeting where the two of them, Bukele and Trump, were just like vibing, laughing, having fun, making fun of reporters together, clearly kind of cut from the same cloth. And Bukele whole thing, like where these big prisons came from is, to kind of quote unquote solve the legitimate gang problems in El Salvador. He just mass arrested like a ton of the men. Does that quote unquote solve the problem? I mean, kind of. If you arrest all the men in America, guess what? Violent crime will go to zero. But the reason that people don't do that is because you catch up a bunch of innocent people in said nets, right? And, then you're also just kind of moving the problem to inside the prisons. But they're just so in the same mold. Like they love the power, they love being the center of attention and making fun of people and being cruel and like finding it funny because it doesn't even cross your mind anymore because it's like such a foregone conclusion. But a normal administration like would want to get him back, right? Even a normal administration kind of hell-bent on quashing the illegal immigration problem would say this guy is not the guy we're talking about, right? Like we don't want to get into this fight about, a devoted father of whatever, married to an American citizen, blah blah blah, right? But it's just they clearly think that this issue is such a good one for them that there's no profile sympathetic enough to like change the public's bloodlust for just kicking brown people out of the country.
I do. It's funny. I'm curious. I'm not sure you could poll this case because you can't. I mean, this is one of the problems that exists in polling and people don't really talk about, that you know everybody in the US can have an opinion about immigration and an opinion about illegal immigration. As we know, that doesn't mean you're you don't have to be informed about it, but we're in a way we're not really trying to find out if you're informed about it, because in most cases with polls, we want to know they are in a sense predictive of your motivations in voting, right? So kind of you're not it doesn't accomplish anything to say, well, we only talk about people who, to people who are highly knowledgeable about the case. So in any case, I'm not sure you can pull that issue. I'm not sure that it is. My sense is that this issue, in a majority sense, is not terribly good for them. I'm sure they, as is always the case for them, they see the issue as, holding on and pumping up their 35% of the electorate. That they think as long as they have that, that's really kind of all that matters.
There is some Pew polling, which I was actually really taken aback by the extent of the unpopularity of deporting people who fit his profile,
Mhm, mhm.
particularly those who are married to US citizens or parents of US citizens. It's like 14-15% approve deporting those people. Even deporting undocumented people who have a job is
Yeah.
hugely lopsidedly unpopular. And I was taken aback by that, which maybe is just like the success of right wing kind of messaging on this issue. But I mean, that's pretty significant. Like, that is a wide swath of people.
Yeah, no, it I'm not I mean, I'm pretty familiar with these polls, and I'm not surprised. If you look at what the administration was saying, during the transition before they actually came in, they were, when people were basically saying like, okay, you campaigned on mass deportation. Are you really going to do this? This sort of horrific mass deportation. And Homans and JD Vance and all these people were, their immediate response was always, well, look, we're going to focus on the people on the people who've been convicted of crimes. Or sometimes they would say like, the people who've committed violent crimes. So which tells you that they know that the number of people who support deporting people who are working, not causing problems, let alone if they are, immediate relations of American citizens. Most people don't support that. And that kind of shows you the weirdness of the whole debate, because anybody who follows this stuff, I mean, no one comes here to go like, yeah, I'm going to come here, I'm just going to go on vacation once I get here. I mean, people are coming here to work. I mean, just by definition, that's obvious if you actually kind of understand any part of what's going on. So if you are actually, if your policy is actually only to deport people who've committed crimes, especially serious crimes, violent crimes, well, first of all, that's always been the policy. You commit a violent crime in the United States, if you are, let alone if you're undocumented, if you're a green card holder, you know, you first go to jail and then you're gone, you're immediately deported. So that's everybody's policy, first of all. And if you're trying to, you're just not going to be able to deport that many people. That's just obvious. So it's one of these, I think the best case, because that, if we just look at it that way, it can seem like, wow, maybe this whole thing is a misunderstanding. We just need to kind of make clear to everybody what we're actually talking about, who's being deported and who's not. But I do think besides the people who just don't want the country to get less white, there is a significant slice of the country that feels a great sense of disorder if lots of people who don't have permission to be in the country are showing up at the border and either sneaking in or uh, you know making asylum claims that can't be processed for 4 or 5 years. um, but as you say, it is the stuff they want to do never gets a lot of support.
And that's why I think there's a little bit of internecine consternation on the Democratic side about how hard to go on this, because Democrats are still so cowed on immigration. Like, a lot of them feel like that was an important part of Trump's win in 2024. And we talked about this on a pod before, but we're not even getting the kind of like bog standard boilerplate type America is a country of immigrants, immigration makes us stronger. Like, even that has kind of gone by the wayside for Democrats. Um, but I think some of them are recognizing that this case, like many things in politics, cannot be like neatly captured by, consultant data or whatever. So you have Chris Van Hollen, one of the Maryland senators, who said, "Well, okay, I'm going to go to El Salvador and I'm going to try to see him and like make sure he's okay and communicate with him and talk to kind of my, whatever folks on the El Salvador side to try and see what we can do to get him back." And I have to say, I find it really impressive. It seems like exactly the right thing you should be doing if one of your constituents is caught up in this. I think for what it's worth, it's like pretty brave. I mean, I don't know that he's under a whole ton of like immediate threat, but you know, he's still he's doing it. He's going himself, right? He's not sending people. He's not giving a speech. He's going in person.
Hmm.
And I think it's just a really, also I think it's a smart way to kind of harness the growing concern about this guy. I mean, and going back to what you said about the makeup artist, it's kind of tough to process, being in these hearings and listening to these cases that like their lives may depend on how sympathetic their like boiled down biographies are. It is pretty upsetting to me to think that some of the men caught up in this just don't it doesn't play as well in a one sentence,
Yeah, because if
summary of their life.
exactly, because if you say like, "Oh, this guy, he worked in construction, and one time he passed out at a party drunk,"
Right.
like like that's a lot of people's lives, right? Those people don't deserve to go to a gulag, right? But as you
Right.
say, if you're not like not just gay, makeup artist gay, right? I mean,
Mhm.
we know what they're saying. He's not
Yeah.
just he's not just gay. He's like a super effeminate dude because obviously being a makeup artist. And like I
Right.
said,
It's he's not
more
a
power
threat
to
in
the
all caps, right?
exactly. And no, and how could he be a gang member?
Yeah.
Those gang members chew those guys up or whatever. So
And, for what it's worth, I'd like to add, even if you are a person who has committed a violent crime, you also shouldn't get disappeared into an El Salvador torture prison without a hearing. But this is where we are right now, and it sucks, and it makes you feel like you wish people would just like pay a little more attention, and they didn't need this like caricature spoon feeding of the sympathy of the people it's coming to. But this is how everything always is about everything. So
and
to
and,
the
and let's
extent that it's getting people to care and getting people to tune in, fine.
and let's be clear with the lawyers. Again, the lawyers are not trying to make a case about inclusion and
Right. This is their job.
gay rights. Yes, they want to get the guy back. So they're gonna
Yeah.
and look, in our it's a good argument, right? Because it is in our society, it is convincing. So, more power to them. They're trying to get uh client out of prison. I agree with you on the Van Hollen thing. I mean, I'm pretty confident, although kind of who knows, that senators, U.S. senators, serving U.S. senators, are pretty inviolate. I will say this though, like I want to be very general here, but I discussed a story. I you know was talking with some sources a couple days ago about someone who has lost their permission to be in the United States, right? Okay. And so they have to leave, but this person is afraid to leave because to leave the United States, you have to go through customs, right? If you get on a plane, you go through customs. If you go to the Mexico border, you go through customs. And this person, again, they're no longer here no longer here legally. They've been told to leave. They're saying, "Okay, I'm leaving," but they're too afraid to come into contact with customs because they're afraid either they're going to get, you know, unlikely they're going to get sent to El Salvador, but who knows? I mean, who knows, really, right? I mean, like, if it were me, if I were in that position, I'd be worried about that. But it's certainly not crazy to think they just might put you in some detention center in the United States, right? So, like, that shows you the kind of Kafka-esque climate that they have, that they have created. Like, dude, I'm trying to leave. Can I leave? But who trusts these people? It's clearly a, ICE customs isn't ICE, but for these purposes, kind of the same thing. That's nuts. But back to Van Hollen, I agree with you because I suspect they will not let let him see them. But even that is helpful because really, I mean, you know, uh, great respect to the Salvadoran people, but El Salvador is a little country that is essentially like a city state in Latin America that has long been dependent on some good kinds of U.S. aid, some maybe not great kinds of U.S. aid. If a U.S. senator shows up and says, "Can I see my constituent? I just want to make sure he is like intact and alive and being treated okay," and for this Bukale guy to say like, "Hey, get lost," I don't think people are going to like that. And just in the way that I don't think people I think there's a lot of evidence that a sizable majority of Americans don't like this idea of people literally being snatched off the street and disappearing.
And the Van Hollen thing seems to be inspiring, kind of like a rash of copycatting. So, Cory Booker's putting together a trip, and some House Democrats are talking about going to see, people from their districts. So, all of that is good. All of that totally fits in what we've been saying is that, when you're in the minority, you don't have a lot of power and you got to get creative. This is a really good way to do it. You know, Combined with, I think, just being the right thing to do. Like, if you are a person of above average power in the United States, like, it is your moral duty to do what you can to try to get these people back. So yeah, no, I think that's really good.
Can I ask one factual
Yeah.
question about this? Because something you said at the beginning of the episode, where you said, and I didn't realize that his wife is a U.S. citizen. And I
Mhm.
did notice I think for the first time, I guess
Yep.
before some hearing, she spoke before the cameras. And as you know, she looks to be, I don't know, a woman about 30, something like that, kind of very nice seeming young woman talking about her husband, which is very affecting as it should be. What sort of surprises me there is that kind of in the old days, I think a lot of us thought like if you have a legitimate marriage to a US citizen, like what are we even talking about? Right? So and clearly no one is doubting that this is like a paper marriage or something like this. I believe they have children. So is do we know why uh do we know why that isn't more of a solution to the problem?
It's really weird because his story, he fled El Salvador when he was a teenager because of the gang stuff. Um, was in the country illegally, but then got like dispensation from a judge that was okay, you can't be deported back there because he'd be in danger, right? And as you say, all of that shouldn't really matter now anyway because he married a citizen. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Like
just it seems to just be another kind of data point in this what we've been talking about, this clear testing how much the system will hold with kind of expanding out from, the pool of kind of
mhm.
least
Mhm.
protected people to
Yep.
people with a little more protections and a little more. And, as Trump said in the Oval Office, that he is totally down with, deporting citizens, or as he called them, homegrown criminals, to El Salvador as well.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that in that case, and it's not, you don't become a citizen on day one. You don't even get a green card in day one, but it's a pretty big part of American immigration law that, they investigate to make sure it's a legitimate marriage, but kind of from day one, you're not going to get deported. and you have a fairly fast track to a green card, blah blah blah. I think one thing to just for us to make explicit here is that it's not simply or even primarily a matter of you have a right to be here if you marry a US citizen. It's that a US citizen has a right to decide who they want to spend their lives with. So it's the rights of the US citizen that is an issue. She married this guy, she has kids with this guy. She has a standing vis-a-vis the US government not to destroy my family. And that is a profound standing as a US citizen. It's just, anyway, I we'll try to find out kind of what the story is in that part of this story. But in any case, I did not realize that until again yesterday that he's married to a citizen.
So, yeah, let's just talk about the law piece before we move on here. So, that 9-0 ruling, I think most of us kind of read as mostly good, right? I mean, good that they didn't just say, this is fine.
Too bad, yeah.
Right. A little bit frustrating in terms of, they told everyone that they kind of have to go back to the district court and like fight over the wording and what does it mean to facilitate, and just you could tell reading the order like this is going to
He's
cause
gonna be
more
there
back
for a
and
while. Yep,
forths, right? Like it's
yep.
going to drag this out longer. um and some people read it, I think rightly, as a little bit nibbly around the edges in terms of it was something less than
Do it.
go get him back right
Yep.
now. You have the power to do it, and we're telling you to do it. And some people interpreted that as a little bit of kicking the can down the road in terms of setting up this direct showdown of we are unequivocal in what we're telling you to do, and if you don't do it, you're ignoring a court order from the Supreme Court, right? And this whole kind of looming constitutional crisis debate, like you could see the Overton window move on it from the beginning of the term, where it used to be what are we going to do when Trump ignores a court order? And then that morphed into what are we going to do when Trump ignores a Supreme Court order, as if it's not as big a deal for him to ignore other kinds of federal judges, which I have always thought is a little silly, and B, a little political in terms of the baked in, like, well, these are all his guys, so it's worse. And then C, a little bit, we don't have to deal with this problem yet if it's the Supreme Court and not a lower court judge, which you could argue they've been ignoring in like multiple cases already, everything from this stuff to like agency firing cases. So it's going to go back down. They're going to fight over the wording a little bit, and then but you can just sense, unless the Trump coalition in court acts completely different than the way the Trump coalition out of court is acting, you're going to get to an impasse where it's just they're saying no, right? I mean, I'm sure they'll phrase it in a way of like, we can, he's not in our custody. What, do you want us to invade El Salvador? That kind of thing. But you get the feeling that we're headed for a moment where the court is either going to have to decide to say, kind of give a stronger version of that order, say, no, these excuses aren't good enough. You got to get him, or they capitulate and avoid the kind of head-on-head collision here. It's like it's a game of chicken and somebody has to fold, or we are really just staring down the barrel of what do you do if the administration just won't do what its own friendly Supreme Court tells it to. I mean, and where that to me feels like the land of mass protest and work stoppages and refusal to pay taxes. I mean, we're at a extreme point, when that, I think not if, when that occurs.
Hmm. Yeah, we were Kate and I were talking about this before we started recording, and I mean, there's two. If and Kate, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe there are two orders. There's the one order that focused on, it has to be where they physically are, but they get, hey, there's the a right for, to file a habeas petition. And then there was an additional order, and I take it that these were both, I guess, per curiam. So we're either, I'm not sure if it was assumed or explicit that they're not, 9-0. And in that second one, that's where Roberts said, and the difference is key here, facilitate the release from custody in El Salvador. And it's interesting that when it went back to the judge, I think this is part of what the administration was doing so Robert says it goes back to the judge, and he adds in there a very, Federalist Society sprinkling of let's make sure we get the wording right, because a judge can't. I think what he was saying was essentially, look, a judge can't reach into the president's foreign policy powers and just say, okay, invade this country, do this, do that, use this kind of jet fighter, blah 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 blah. So let's make sure we're kind of getting the wording right, that which thing we're doing and not doing. And then the district judge made an order that said facilitate his return. And the government then responded, return? Like, okay, we'll open the door. If he if if he if he manages to come back to America, we'll let him in. But and it's not really a criticism of the judge, because everybody heard what the Supreme Court said. They were clear. She didn't repeat it, so that allowed this kind of, I think, a few more days of game playing. But again, the Supreme Court was clear. You facilitate, which I think what that means is you make your best efforts to get him out of prison in El Salvador and bring him back here so he can get the due process that he should have had in the beginning. My read here is that I was frankly pleasantly surprised that they said that, because I have a very low opinion of this highly corrupted Supreme Court. But now that they have said it, I don't think they can. I don't think they have any space to walk that back without a level of institutional humiliation that I don't think Roberts, and I suspect at least 5 of the justices, are willing to allow. They just didn't leave themselves. Again, it's not there. Because all this stuff about when, we were talking before about the meeting in the Oval Office, where, as you said, Trump said, "Hey, I'm not president of El Salvador. What can I do?" And Bukele's like, "Hey, I'm not going to try to send terrorists to America." Yeah, it is part of, in that very degenerate world in which those guys live, it is one of the principal expressions of power to lie. It is literally an expression of power. I can talk bullshit to you, and that's all there is, because no one can stop me. And literally, I'm expressing my power by saying things that are totally nonsensical. I don't think this Supreme Court is going to go for that in this case, because everybody knows that Bukele is working as the employee of Donald Trump. And that guy could be brought back here on a day's notice. Again, I'm not, for our listeners, I'm not saying like, I guarantee you he's coming back. I don't know, but I'm just giving you my sense of the judicial politics. I don't think they're willing to allow that level of judicial institutional humiliation. And I think that order is clear enough that there's no walking it back to where the administration wants it to be without that level of institutional humiliation. So I don't know. That's my take. I could definitely be wrong, but we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I'm less optimistic, but also my soul has been deadened. Also, I think the way that we could probably expect this to unwind is, as you said, they're already kind of like doing this little, like, bratty, like, "Nah, nah, nah, I'm not touching you" thing in the district court where the judge is asked for these kind of, like, daily status updates of, like, where is he? How's he doing? What are you doing to facilitate his release? And they're stonewalling, not saying anything or just repeating the same things over and over. We don't know. He's not in our custody anymore, that kind of thing. That the natural, I think, next steps there are what a judge can do to, like, punish a party for being non-compliant like this. And maybe that
Right.
looks like X punishment every day that the administration doesn't do X, right? Or, some kind of fees thing or, you know, contempt thing. And you would think that that kind of thing is what will get up to the court again, the
Right.
appeal of her trying to, like, force them to act.
Right.
Um,
Right. Let me ask you a little bit more about that because that is the operative question. Obviously, for us to get to that point, it has to go back up there, right? It has
mhm.
to go back to the Supreme Court. So I take it that where we are right now is that the judge will have to impose some sort of sanction that is serious enough that that the White House, I mean, technically the Justice Department, that the White House will then appeal it to the Supreme Court, and then we're back, and then we get the confrontation that we're talking about. And I guess it's clearly it's not going to be well, I have no idea, but it will need to be something that will be serious because otherwise, I guess they're happy to sit here doing this forever, playing this game. So in any case, I guess that's where we are.
I mean, I think that and the natural endpoint that they'll want to avoid is a judge saying, "Okay, if you can't get them back when they're there, you can't deport anybody. You have to keep them in US custody until all of the kind of federal law questions are played out here,"
That's a
which you would
that's a
think would
that's
run a little counter to, how they want
that's
things to go.
That's a good one. That's a good one because that would, yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I'm sure she could, in theory, say, like, okay, you can't deport anyone, like, not just to like the El Salvadoran gulag. She could make some sort of like wildly expansive thing that will force their hands. Because what I worry about there is, if she says, okay, $1,000 a day, I'm sure the Justice Department's like, cool, take that out of
Right.
the U.S. Treasury. Well, no, that's we don't worry. So that makes sense. That gives me somehow or another this has to get back up to the Supreme Court. That gives me a bit more of a sense that there is a pretty obvious way to do that with that kind
Mhm.
of ruling that the Supreme Court will. Well, we get the idea.
Right, right. Okay, so the other thing we wanted to cover today is there's this ongoing outstanding race from 2024 where Republicans are really, really trying to steal it. And it's kind of nuts because not that Republicans are trying to steal a race, but they're trying to steal one that is grand scheme, not that consequential. I mean, a North Carolina Supreme Court seat is important, but the Republican majority is so lopsided. I think it's 5-2 or something. So, if you were kind of watching this death match play out, you could be forgiven for thinking it's for like who controls the majority or something, but it's just kind of going from a minuscule minority to a slightly less minuscule minority.
It's interesting because I didn't think it was over control, but I thought it was closer. I didn't
No.
realize that it's not even terribly close.
Right.
Interesting, interesting. Okay.
So this is the race between Allison Riggs and Jefferson Griffin. And when it, was decided in November, it was super close, right? She only won by I think 762 votes. So um
Which is
he kind of
close, but not recount close. Like
right.
700 is not close when you get into like looking at the hanging chads and stuff, just for
You mean not
our
close
clear.
enough in terms that a recount would like flip
Exactly,
that
exactly,
election, right?
exactly, exactly.
So he kind of exercised all that stuff, the recount stuff, nothing went anywhere. So then he, who is also a sitting judge, mind you, goes on this months long campaign to get votes tossed out. And I mean, this is like kind of surgical stuff, right? I mean, he wants votes tossed in Democratic districts. And this, it's gone through so many iterations by now, but the kind of latest where we are is that the North Carolina Supreme Court said no to most of his gambits, except they said these overseas, mostly military ballots will get tossed if they're not cured in this 30-day period. And the root of this is just absurd. It's that the overseas people didn't submit like a photo ID with their ballot. And the lawyers on the other side have said, first of all, they weren't asked to. And not only were they not asked to, there was no way to. Like, most of them did this through these like online portal things. Even if they wanted to submit a photo, there's nowhere to submit it to, right? So that's playing out. And then they took this other small grouping of votes and said that they were never residents and that their votes get tossed point blank. Now, that doesn't really seem to be true either. There's this one guy who's like a local reporter who's really dug into this and is following up with like the individual people. Some of them have lived in North Carolina their whole lives. So, it's just completely a mess. And while that is kind of happening on the state level, now the case has been escalated into federal court as well, which makes it almost certain that this will reach the Supreme Court. North Carolina is in the Fourth Circuit, which is a pretty Democratic appointee heavy circuit court. So the case weirdly has a lot of the same issues that were at play in Bush v. Gore in terms of the central question of, can you change election laws after the election has already happened? And can you change it for some voters and not for others? That is one of the weirdest parts of this. Not only, I mean, him trying to kind of target Democratic constituencies is bad, but you understand why he's doing it, right? It's a pretty obvious attempt to get rid of her voters and not his. But you also have the weirdness that these voters voted for a lot of other people too, and all those elections have been certified.
And so I've been curious about this. A, what is the argument? How that can possibly be okay? I assume the argument is that the other races weren't this close, so it's kind of it
Who
wouldn't
cares if
matter.
they get
It is,
tossed?
but no, I mean I don't think that, but but again,
Yeah,
it's so absurd on its face that it's sort of like Trump with Stop the Steal. Like, stop the steal, except the Senate races. Don't stop that steal. Right?
right.
It's sort of like, what? So what is there an argument how that, or just that's not even going there? Doesn't
You would think that that kind of thing will be litigated more in the federal courts because the state courts have been so kind of about the state voting requirements and what was, required and what's not. But
right,
I mean,
okay.
it's just
Well, let me ask you another
mhm,
factual question here. So we've talked about the fact that certain people's votes are maybe going to be thrown out, except they'll still count for other races, which makes no sense. But it sounds like you're also saying that he came up with a new proposed set of rules and said, let's go into the Democratic areas. But it sounds like in the rest of the state, like in some extremely Republican county in the upcountry, those rules just won't apply.
I mean, the irony of this all is that Riggs, before she was a judge, was basically a voting rights lawyer. So,
Yeah, that is a deep. Well, I would say this. It sounds like that the in-state litigation has been entirely on, if we were starting from first principles, what are the rules that should apply, and that the Democrats have been saying, we're not starting from first principles. We had an election, we had a series of rules then. You can't go back and make them different. I would certainly assume that at the federal level, they would get into, you can't, you certainly can't change the rules after the fact, only in the areas where I got most of my votes. I mean, that's such a foundational equal protection thing. But as you say, that's kind of Bush v. Gore.
I mean, I mostly wanted to talk about this, not for the specifics of that election, even though, I mean, it's so egregious, but we're thinking a lot about 26, right? Like a lot of Democrats are clinging to the 26 elections as the first moment where
Hmm.
Democrats can wrest back power, where anyone can kind of put brakes on Trump. And a lot of what you see is encapsulated in this kind of like snarky social media thing of like, oh, you think there'll be elections in 2026? Like, very cute kind of
Yep.
thing. And, I have been talking to some election people, for an unrelated story on his executive order and the SAVE Act in the House and these attempts by Republicans to kind of do voter suppression. And I mean, people are worried, like the kind of best thing you hear in terms of, well, it'll be hard for him to pull that off is just how decentralized American elections are, right? Like it's really hard for even the president to kind of be like, elections are canceled because this is something that's so fundamentally administered on a state and local level. And that's why we saw this executive order that was ham fistedly trying to use the Election Administration Commission to kind of bend states to his will through the small links that the federal government kind of have into election administration. And that, for our listeners will remember, was the order about having to show proof of citizenship to vote, and that if states don't do that, they'll withhold federal funding, that kind of thing. And I kind of ran that down with a few people, and they were mostly saying this would affect the federal form, right? And most states have their own forms, and
Yep.
very few kind of domestic voters vote that way. And also, in terms of the stick of the federal funding, one of the people said, I think we got something like $50 million for a presidential election cycle from the federal government. And she's like, to put that in perspective, that's one off year election in Los Angeles. So, it's a really small kind of part of the pot.
Hmm.
But it shows you the way they're thinking, right? That they know that it's hard and that they won't have allies in all these places, right? So they're trying to figure out a way to kind of from on high take control. And the SAVE Act is a version of this too, even though it's funny. Like I'm writing about this too, but the idea that Republican voter suppression, especially now that there's some party realignment going on, is so much less surgical than it
Right.
used to
Right.
be.
Yeah.
So they're
It is
using these
ironic. It
like
is ironic. Yeah.
right, these big blunt instruments that leave you with end results like it'll be really hard for married women to vote. And you're like, well, I don't know that that necessarily will hurt Democrats more than Republicans long term, right? But again, it's this attempt to federalize elections, to like take control of all these with all these levers that they control right now. And I think that is kind of the best rose colored glasses look at it. But then you kind of look at the rig stuff for concerns in the other direction, including that if House Democrats are going to take over the majority, which, seems like the kind of easiest chamber to do it in, they're going to have to win some seats in unfriendly territory or in states that are governed by right wing Supreme Courts, And I mean, that doesn't give me a whole ton of confidence. And even though the Supreme Court was, I think, in 2020 was very much like, no, we are not doing this. We are not taking
Hmm.
the election from you. I mean, does anyone have any confidence that that would hold for like lower, lower octane elections for things, a little further down the ballot that isn't so history changing as a presidential one?
Hmm. Well, look, I am fairly confident about the what is going to happen in 2026. I'm extremely confident that these people are saying, "Oh, he's going to cancel the elections." You can't. That is not, even in the bad scenario, that's not how any of this happens. Um, they're not going to look, the schedule and the occurrence of the elections is in the Constitution. New York State is not going to not hold an election. California is not going to not hold an election. That is not going to happen. That is not going to happen in any blue state that an election is not held. On the other side of the equation, I'm quite confident there's going to be an election in Mississippi, because why not? Right? They need to send their own people. So uh, that's and this is a case where the fact that election administration is decentralized is huge, because and we've I've talked about this in a number of editors blogs. You have subordinate but separate sovereignties in this country, right? There's federal supremacy, the supremacy of federal law, but the states exist in a different universe of sovereignty. It isn't, what we have seen so much in the last 2 or 3 months, this kind of terrifying thing where people who don't report to the president, suddenly they do, right? Suddenly someone who's independent, who has, a kind of a charter for what they do, president just sort of shows up, or his heavies show up and they're fired. There's simply no mechanism like that with the states. A governor does not work for the president. So where, as you say, where things get sticky is in purple states, where maybe you've got certain states that elect a lot of Democrats, but they've got a Republican Supreme Court, or they've got a Republican governor. There, it gets a little, it gets a little fuzzier. Or in cases where, in a state like Texas, where it's a Republican state, they're going to win most of the seats, but you still got to hold on to seats, right? I mean, there's a substantial number of Democrats who have to come from there, and it's a Republican. So, you've got all of these things. Look, there's going to be an election. Um, are there threats against it in these kind of overlap areas? Yes, for precisely this reason. It's not the only thing. Republicans are already making this big thing about Act Blue. There's all these kind of, stop the steal, like, conspiracy theories now about Act Blue. All the money's actually coming from China, and it's all corrupt and everything. The first law firm to get one of these executive orders was Perkins Coie, which is basically mostly the law firm of the National Democratic Party. So there are multiple ways at the margins that the president can apply pressure. Again, for what it's worth, and you can disagree with me. I am, for a number of reasons, based on a lot of nitty gritty details we don't have time to get into, am fairly confident that that we're going to have a real election that Democrats can win. But I will say this: it is critical right now, not just because of this election stuff, but because of a whole bunch of other reasons. People need to get involved in their states, especially states like North Carolina, especially all of these kind of, for lack of a better word, kind of frontier states, right? Where it's kind of it's a bit of each, to organize and get active about protecting the integrity of elections. Because and in this case, integrity of elections, that kind of like when they vote and after the recount, that's it. So this is a political struggle, and again, if you're in one of those states, you absolutely should do this. And this is an example, because this is like an absurd. This challenge is absurd on just a number of different a number of different fronts, and that's my take on it. But I'm curious, Kate, you're talking to a lot more, um, these election lawyers, election experts. What are they pointing to? You've mentioned a few of them. Are there other kind of pressure points that they're pointing to? Pressure points of where things could get bad in terms of fair elections.
I mean, you've had some like resurgence of old school voter suppression stuff on the state level
Hmm.
that they have like much more leeway to kind of implement. I mean, in Arizona, they did one of these citizenship proof measures. Of course, it's harder because when it's not so clearly that the kind of working class people who are less likely to have this documentation are Democrats,
Yeah.
you're catching a lot of Republicans in the net. Like, someone told me that the Arizona measure has ended up thwarting more Republican votes than Democratic ones. But the other optimistic thing people have pointed to is just that kind of left aligned firms, which, as you say, they're getting targeted, but there are a lot of them that are just really, really well practiced at this stuff by now because they have so much experience
Hmm.
fighting back on this
Hmm.
kind of suppression. So, there's that small, small star in a dark, dark sky.
Yeah, one thing is it overlaps here, in this whole, because obviously the law firm agreement story intersects here with our story, and one of the ways to understand that law firm agreement story is that basically all of the ones that are making the agreements are top 20 big law firms, and most of those law firms are, the reason they are doing it is a lot of those firms are, the real money they are making is in M&A and other corporate work, and that is work that you are, it it's mergers and acquisitions. You're coming up against antitrust stuff. You need the government's permission. um but the saving grace here is that there are a lot of real law firms, people who do stuff in court, right? And I know that, look, I know we have a lot of lawyers in the audience. I know that not all lawyers are litigators, but M&A work is, in many key ways, there are, some of these firms are more like investment banks, adjuncts of investment banks than what we normally think of as law firms. The point for our purposes in this conversation, there are lots of law firms that are taking no part in this agreement stuff. Lots of people who can make great arguments. They're more than good enough, more than solid enough. So that part of it, I'm pretty confident about.
And on that like tepidly optimistic note, we will leave you.
Yeah. Well, let me reiterate. Thank you for everybody who bought a ticket to the event almost exactly 1 month from now in Chicago. So we're really looking forward to seeing all of you. And if you didn't get a ticket yet and you're interested, as I said, we've opened up a waiting list. And for this episode, I guess that's all we got.
All right, see you next week.
Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.